about when Karl Malone gets included on teams like this?
I like it. I mean, I think he's top 20 greatest players to play.
You think Karl Malone is?
Yeah.
But what about his off the court stuff? You know, does that factor in it at all?
I really don't know a lot of off the court horse stuff.
He got a 13-year-old pregnant.
He's one of the most dominant players in NBA history, a man who carved out a legendary career with sheer strength, relentless consistency, and a partnership that defined an entire era of basketball. Karl Malone, the Mailman, delivered night after night, becoming the face of the Utah Jazz and a household name across the league. But behind the highlight reels, the MVP awards, and the Olympic gold medals lies a story the NBA never wanted to talk about. A story that was buried for decades, ignored by the media, and only whispered about by those who dared to bring it up. How did a man who scored more points than almost anyone in league history manage to keep such a disturbing secret hidden in plain sight? And why, even now, do so many fans know Karl Malone only as a basketball icon, while others see him as something far darker? This is the untold story of Karl Malone, his rise from a small Louisiana farm to NBA superstardom, and the scandal that threatened to destroy everything. Karl Malone's story doesn't start under the bright lights of the NBA. It starts in Summerfield, Louisiana, a tiny rural town where opportunities were scarce and life was about survival. He was born on July 24th, 1963, the youngest of 9 children, in a home that had more mouths to feed than money to go around. His father, Shedrick Hay, lived in another town with a separate family. He wasn't a consistent presence in Karl's life, and when Karl was just a teenager, his father tragically offed himself. That left his mother, Shirley Malone, to raise 9 kids on her own. She worked endlessly to hold the family together, teaching her children discipline through the only way she knew how: hard work. And for Karl, hard work meant farm life. Long before he was the mailman, he was chopping wood, hauling water, and hunting for food. Every day started before the sun came up, and every chore was a reminder that nothing came easy. If he wanted something, he had to earn it, with sweat, grit, and determination. These struggles weren't just obstacles, they were lessons. They hardened him, gave him a sense of toughness and resilience that would one day fuel his rise in basketball. But they also instilled in him a certain distance, a sense that vulnerability wasn't an option, and that showing weakness could mean being left behind. In school, basketball became the one place where Karl could escape the grind of daily life. On the court, he wasn't just another kid from a poor farm town. He was someone special. His natural size and strength made him a force, and by the time he reached high school, it was clear he had a gift. But it's important to remember, Karl Malone didn't grow up with the polished image of a sports prodigy. He didn't have fancy trainers, private gyms, or endless scouts watching his every move. He came from a place where kids weren't supposed to dream that big. And maybe that's why, when he finally started to rise, he carried himself with such a relentless drive. For Karl, basketball wasn't just a game, it was a way out. By the time Karl Malone was a teenager, the farm chores and long days of labor had already sculpted his body into something most kids his age couldn't match. He was big, strong, and intimidating, a natural force. But in Summerfield, Louisiana, raw strength didn't guarantee a future. It was just survival. Basketball changed that. At Summerfield High School, Malone became a legend in the making. The small-town kid with the workhorse mentality transformed into a dominant athlete. He wasn't just good, he was unstoppable. Malone led his team to 3 straight Louisiana state championships from 1979 to 1981, putting Summerfield on the map. But here's the surprising part. Despite all that success, Malone wasn't heavily recruited. Scouts saw him as raw, too unpolished, not disciplined enough. In today's world, with social media highlights and national exposure, a player like Malone would have been tracked since middle school. Back then, in a small Louisiana town, it was easy for someone like him to be overlooked. The one school that took a chance was Louisiana Tech University. It wasn't a basketball powerhouse. It wasn't Kentucky. It wasn't North Carolina. But for Malone, it was an opportunity, the only one that truly mattered. At Louisiana Tech, he didn't just improve, he transformed. The farm boy turned into a college star. Coaches pushed him, teammates relied on him, and fans quickly realized they were watching something special. By his junior year, Malone was carrying the Bulldogs on his back. In 1985, Malone led Louisiana Tech to its best season in school history, a 29-3 record and their first ever trip to the NCAA tournament. For a program with no national recognition, This was history in the making. And at the center of it all was Malone, a player who had turned doubt into dominance. It was during this time that he earned the nickname the Mailman. Teammates and opponents alike said the same thing. He always delivered. Whether it was scoring in the paint, cleaning up rebounds, or simply outmuscling anyone who stood in his way, Karl Malone had become a guaranteed presence. But the real turning point was what came next. NBA scouts who once doubted him were now forced to pay attention. His name climbed draft boards, and in the summer of 1985, the Utah Jazz called his name with the 13th pick in the NBA draft, a decision that would change not only Malone's life, but also the future of the franchise. For a kid who came from a tiny farm town in Louisiana with almost no resources and every reason to fail, Karl Malone was about to step onto the biggest stage in basketball. But while the world saw a story of hard work and triumph, there were shadows already forming in the background. Because before Malone ever played a single NBA game, there was a secret, one that would follow him for the rest of his life. When the 1985 NBA draft came around, Karl Malone wasn't a household name. He slipped all the way to the 13th overall pick, where the Utah Jazz decided to take a chance on him. At the time, it didn't seem like a franchise-altering decision. But looking back, it was one of the greatest steals in draft history. Malone entered the league with something to prove. He wasn't the flashiest player. He didn't come from a basketball powerhouse, and he knew that people doubted his skill set. But what he did have was a body built for punishment and a mindset forged by years of hard labor. And in the NBA, that combination was deadly. It didn't take long for fans to see why he was called the Mailman. He always delivered. Night after night, Malone pounded his way into the paint, scoring with brute strength and relentless consistency. By his second season, he was averaging over 20 points per game, and by his third, he was already an all-star. But Malone's career wasn't built on individual talent alone. In Utah, he found the perfect partner, John Stockton. Together, the two formed one of the most unstoppable duos in basketball history. Stockton, the quiet point guard with laser-sharp vision, and Malone, the unstoppable force rolling to the basket. Their pick and roll became a nightmare for defenses, so effective that it's still studied decades later. Through the late 80s and 90s, Malone's numbers were staggering. He became a two-time league MVP, racked up 14 All-Star selections, and finished his career with over 36,000 points, making him the third highest scorer in NBA history. To this day, only Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and LeBron James have more, and then there was the 1992 Dream Team. Malone joined legends like Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, and Larry Bird to dominate the Barcelona Olympics. It wasn't just basketball, it was a global showcase, and Malone's name became forever cemented as one of the greats. But for all his dominance, there was one thing Malone never achieved, an NBA championship. Twice he reached the finals, both times running into Michael Jordan's Chicago Bulls. Twice, he walked away empty-handed. It became the one glaring hole in his resume. Still, when people talked about Karl Malone, the conversation was almost always about his greatness on the court. His legacy was about the points, the power, and the partnership with Stockton. But while the world focused on the Mailman delivering in the NBA, there was a much darker delivery from his past, one that had already happened before he ever stepped foot on an NBA court. And as we'll see, that story wasn't just buried, it was actively ignored. For most fans, Karl Malone's story is one of hard work, dominance, and consistency. But away from the spotlight, there was a hidden truth. A truth so serious that if it had come out during his playing days, it could have completely changed the way people saw him. The year was 1983. Karl Malone was a 20-year-old sophomore at Louisiana Tech University, already making a name for himself as a rising basketball star. But at the same time, he was involved with a 13-year-old girl named Gloria Bell. That relationship resulted in a child, Demetrius Bell, who would later grow up to play in the NFL. Think about that for a second. While Malone was gearing up to become the Mailman, the NBA's next big star, he had already fathered a child with someone barely in her teens. When news of the child first surfaced in the mid-1980s, Malone denied responsibility. But a paternity test proved otherwise, showing with over 99% certainty that he was indeed the father. By any measure, the truth was undeniable. And yet, Malone didn't step forward. He didn't claim responsibility. Instead, the matter was settled quietly, with Malone eventually reaching an out-of-court settlement to provide financial support. And that should have been a massive scandal. A rising college star confirmed by the courts to have fathered a child with a 13-year-old? That's the kind of story that would dominate headlines today. But back then, nothing. The story never gained traction. This case was barely whispered about outside of local coverage. National sports outlets didn't report it, the NBA never acknowledged it, and fans rarely heard a word. It was as if the scandal had been swept under the rug, buried beneath Malone's rising superstardom. Why? Some point to the power of the NBA in the 1980s. The league was exploding in popularity, thanks to stars like Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and later Michael Jordan. Karl Malone was supposed to be part of that next wave of greatness. A scandal this explosive could have derailed not just his career, but also hurt the league's carefully crafted image. The NBA didn't need one of its future stars embroiled in a scandal that would spark outrage and controversy. So the whispers stayed whispers. Meanwhile, Malone kept building his career, breaking records, collecting MVP trophies, and chasing championships. He became known as the Mailman, and he kept scoring and he kept delivering. He was being celebrated as one of the greatest forwards of his generation, all while a young boy, Demetrius Bell, grew up without his father. Years later, Demetrius would describe the reality bluntly. He didn't know Malone as a father. He didn't see him as a role model. He compared it to his mother going to a sperm bank. For him, Karl Malone wasn't a dad. He was just a stranger whose absence spoke louder than any presence ever could. And that's what makes this scandal so haunting. It wasn't just about the court case, or the settlement, or even the NBA's silence. It was about the human cost. A young boy growing up fatherless. A family left behind while the man at the center of it all became one of the most celebrated athletes on the planet. The scandal would eventually resurface years later, once Malone's career was over, and the media could no longer ignore it. And when the story broke into the mainstream, fans were stunned. How had something this massive been hidden for so long? The answer is simple: timing, power, and control. In the 1980s, protecting the NBA's image was more important than protecting the truth. Malone's secret was locked away, his reputation intact, and the league marched forward as if nothing had happened. But secrets don't stay buried forever, and when statues were raised and honors were handed out decades later, that same scandal came roaring back, louder than ever before. For Karl Malone, the scandal may have been hidden from headlines, but for the families it touched, it was never out of sight. The NBA could bury the story from the public, but it couldn't bury the consequences at home. While Malone was chasing championships, earning MVP awards, and traveling the world as part of the Dream Team, his son, Demetrius Bell, was growing up without him. Imagine the weight of that reality. Watching the man everyone calls the Mailman dominate on national television, knowing he's your father, but also knowing he's never once been there to deliver anything in your life. There were no father-son games of catch. No advice before big moments. No, I'm proud of you after accomplishments. Nothing. And that absence is what made Demetrius's later words so haunting. When asked about Malone, he didn't unleash rage. He didn't scream betrayal. Instead, he described it coldly, almost clinically. I treat it as if my mother went to the sperm bank. Think about that. A Hall of Fame father reduced to the role of a stranger. Not hate, not forgiveness, just emptiness. Sometimes indifference cuts deeper than anger ever could, and Demetrius wasn't the only one. Before Malone settled down with his wife Kay Kinsey in 1990, he had also fathered twin children with another woman. Their story followed a similar path. Years of distance, fractured bonds, and a father whose fame didn't translate into presence. Eventually, Malone did make attempts to reconnect with his children, including Demetrius. There were meetings, conversations, and some effort to bridge the gap. But here's the thing about time. Once childhood is gone, it's gone forever. No apology, no reconciliation, no late arrival can replace the years that were lost. This is the tragic duality of Karl Malone. To millions of fans, he was the Mailman, a symbol of consistency, toughness, and reliability. On the basketball court, he always delivered. But off the court, in the lives of his own children, those deliveries never came. And that contradiction is what makes his story so hard to process. Sports are built on heroes. Fans want to believe in greatness. But Malone's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the people we cheer for, the legends we idolize, are not the people we think they are. When the scandal resurfaced years later, it wasn't just about numbers on a court record. It wasn't just about a legal settlement. It was about real people who carried the burden of his silence for decades. The kids who grew up without him. The families who had to fight for acknowledgement. The pain that didn't go away just because the NBA refused to look. And that silence, Malone's refusal to address the truth head-on, became as much a part of his legacy as his scoring totals. For the children who lived it, silence wasn't protection. It was abandonment. And for fans, silence raises another question. If a man is great in one arena but fails so completely in another, which version of him do we choose to remember? Malone's legacy wasn't just written in box scores. It was written in the lives of those who grew up without him. And that story was impossible to ignore once it finally came to light. But the reckoning didn't stop with family. In recent years, Malone's past has been dragged back into the spotlight in ways even the NBA couldn't suppress. Statues, tributes, and viral clips have forced the world to re-examine his legacy. And the results have been explosive. For a long time, Karl Malone's legacy was protected. When fans talked about him, the conversation was about stats, MVP awards, and the unstoppable pick and roll with John Stockton. The scandal, the broken family ties, the uncomfortable truth, all of that stayed in the shadows. The NBA did such a thorough job of keeping Malone's past out of the spotlight that even people inside the league were in the dark. It wasn't just fans who were shielded from the truth. Some current players had no idea what had really happened. That became crystal clear when a clip of Patrick Beverley went viral. On his podcast, Beverley was casually talking about Malone when his co-host mentioned the scandal. The look on his face said it all.
About when Karl Malone gets included on teams like this.
I like it. I mean, I think he's top 20 greatest players to play.
You think Karl Malone is?
Yeah.
But what about his off the court stuff? You know, does that factor in at all?
I really don't know a lot of off the court horse stuff.
He got a 13-year-old pregnant.
Bruh.
I'm going to go Oscar Robertson and Julius Erving. Timeout? You need a timeout? A 30-second?
No, fool. I need a full timeout. You wait a second. I have a question. When you said 13-year-old pregnant, was he 16?
I think it was a grown-up. He was 20.
Bruh.
That doesn't seem cool to me.
Wrong. I am. Like, I don't. Bruh.
Yeah, that's bad.
Is this true and this is documented?
True and documented.
I didn't even know this. You understand what I'm saying? Like, that's my thing, wrong. I didn't know this at all. So, like,
disappointing. In Karl Malone, not you.
But time has a way of bringing buried stories back to the surface. In 2023, Louisiana Tech University, the very place where Malone became a star, unveiled a massive bronze statue in his honor. What should have been a moment of celebration turned into a firestorm. Fans, students, and commentators questioned how a man with Malone's past could be immortalized on campus. For some, the statue wasn't a tribute. It was a reminder of a disturbing truth the school and the NBA had ignored for decades. Social media lit up. Articles resurfaced, old court records were shared, and Malone's scandal became a trending topic once again. And this time, people weren't willing to look the other way. Even today's NBA stars haven't stayed silent. Rising superstar Victor Wembanyama appeared to take a jab at Malone online, hinting that celebrating him wasn't something the league should be proud of. Fans echoed the sentiment, with some going as far as saying Malone's name should be erased from NBA history discussions altogether. And yet, his numbers remain. He's still the third highest scorer of all time. He's still a Hall of Famer, a Dream Team member, and a two-time MVP. Statistically, he's a giant. But legacy isn't just about numbers. It's about reputation, character, and the story history chooses to tell. Today, Karl Malone sits in a strange place. To some, he's an icon. To others, he's a symbol of how power and influence can protect athletes from accountability. The truth is, both sides are right. He was one of the greatest players to ever step on the court. And he was also a man whose off-court actions cast a shadow that will never fade. Karl Malone's story is unlike almost any other in NBA history. On the court, he was a machine, relentless, durable, and dominant for nearly 2 decades. He left behind numbers that almost no one has touched, a partnership with John Stockton that defined an era, and a reputation as one of the greatest forwards ever to play. But the game isn't the whole story. Away from the hardwood, Malone carried a secret that would eventually come to define him as much as his records. A child with a 13-year-old girl, a paternity test that proved the truth, years of denial, distance, and silence, and an NBA so determined to protect its rising star that it buried the scandal so deep, even other players didn't learn about it until decades later. That's the paradox of Karl Malone. He's a Hall of Famer, an Olympian, and one of the most statistically dominant players in basketball history. Yet he's also a man whose personal choices cast a shadow that refuses to fade. Some fans will always see the Mailman, the player who delivered on the court. Others will only see the scandal the NBA worked so hard to hide. And maybe that's the lasting question. What do we do with legacies like Karl Malone's? Can greatness on the court erase the pain caused off of it? Or should we measure legends not just by their points and records, but by the full story, even the parts that make us uncomfortable? But now I want to hear from you. Should Karl Malone still be celebrated as one of the greatest to ever play? Or should his off-court actions forever shape how we remember him? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's talk about it. And if you found this deep dive eye-opening, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more untold stories from the world of sports. In the end, the Mailman delivered one of the most complicated legacies in sports, and it's up to us, as fans and as a culture, to decide what that really means.